Hi, and welcome to another episode of Discovering DataFlex. Today, we're going to look at creating tables for our application. And since you haven't provided me with any suggestions of applications, I'm going to build something I feel that I might need from time to time. And that is an application where I can easily search all the things I got in my basements or at the attic or in my wardrobe somewhere, because I have things lying around that I'm not aware of, and I should probably throw them out. But sometimes it's good to have, and it would be nice to quickly be able to find where they are. Don't you say? So let's dive in and look at what we're going to do. Usually, when I make a table for a database or a database definition, I start out by drawing on paper, but I think we're going to run with Notepad for this experiment. And I do that as well from time to time. So let's run with that. I need a place where I can have my things. So let's call them items. So we want a table called item, and it should have an ID, so I can uniquely find my item by looking at the ID. And it's also makes it easier to relate. Sometimes you relate by the name, but since I might have two things that are identical with the same name, I want an ID to differentiate them. So name is then a good thing to have. You might have a description if I want to write something more about it. We might want to have an expiration date. It might be that I've put some food in the freezer or some paint in the basement or something, and they have an expiration date. So I want to add that as well. And I could add some kind of category. That could be, for instance, food or renovation stuff or furniture or Christmas things, whatever you have. If you want to make a database over your record collection or your DVD collection, it might be genre or what have you. So you can add anything you like to include in your database here. And I think we're going to go easy. So we're going to start with this. We can always add things later on. But I also want to add one more thing, and that's the location ID, because I want to know where I've stored it, if in the freezer or in the basement or in some cupboard somewhere. And so that could be nice. So I need a location table, and that should also have an ID. Some people like to write location ID as the database name and the item ID in the table. I think it's a little bit overkill, because most of the time when you write location dot ID to access that, and if it says location dot location ID, I just prefer having ID. And a location should probably also have some kind of name or label. Yeah, I think that's it to begin with. We can always add things later and add other tables. So let's get started. Let's put this up here. And let's get into our studio. Yeah. There you go. And here we have our tables. And we want to add a new table. And before we begin, usually in SQL databases, you have a feature called auto increment that you can just set on a table. For instance, an ID is really good to have an auto increment because you want a new ID every time you save a new post. In DataFlex, they have a special way of doing that through a system table. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a system table. We're just going to call it system to make it easy. And it's going to be the embedded. So let's write system, because right now we're working on the embedded database. We're going to move it to SQL later, but right now we're starting out in the embedded database. And here I want to have the item ID, and here I write the item underscore ID, because this is a reference point for where I'm gonna store the number that I increment for the ID. And this is numeric. You can just press N, and usually I have 6 or 10 here. It depends on how big I expect it to be, but let's go for 6 now. And location ID. You can also use this system table for other settings and stuff like that. And we also have to go down here and say that this is a system file and set that to true. Otherwise, the system won't recognize this file as a system file. So now with that done, we can press save and start building our first table. And this is also an embedded item. And in the item, we have an ID. And now it's important that this has the same size as the ID we use. So we want it to be numeric, and we want it to be number 6. And then we want name. And that should be in ASCII, and the name shouldn't be more than 50 characters. We can give it some space. And a description. And we might want to put that to text and give it 128 or something. And then we have a category. And we also might want that to be ASCII 20 or something. And ASCII, that just means how many characters you have can be able to write. And a location ID that refers to the location. This should be numeric and 6 again. And we're not really done yet, because in DataFlex, in order to search anything or look up anything, you need to have an index. And if you want to relate this to the location, for instance, you need a relation set up on the table. You can do without in regular databases, and the main purpose of doing an index or a relation in a regular database is to speed up the process. But in DataFlex, there are actually logic that depends on the table or the column being sorted or indexed in order to be able to do automatic lookups. So that's what we're going to do now. First of all, I always set index 1 to be the ID. And all the indexes here are unique. So I want this ID to be by itself, and it's completely unique. And then I would like to be able to search for the name. And since I don't want the names to be completely unique, I can actually add the ID here. That makes it that this index is unique because every ID is unique, so the name can be anything. So that makes this name not unique, if you get what I mean. I also want to be able to search by category. I might want to have a text search, but I think we're going to look at text search when we move over to the SQL later on. So for now, just leave that. So we want to add an index for category. And also that should not be unique. So we add the ID and location. So I want to be able to look for all the things in the basement. So I want to add an index for that as well. And of course, that's not unique. So we add the ID. Now we should add a relationship for the location ID. But since we haven't created the location table, we need to do that first. So let's save this and then create a location. And this also has this ID, numeric 6, and a name. ASCII shouldn't be more than 30 at least. So let's give it that. And again, we want to put some indexes on here, the ID, and we would like to be able to search on name as well. So now we know index 1 is always the ID, index 2 is always the name, and then the rest come afterwards. So when we do lookups later, we can use those indexes to do specific things. And we save this. But now we also have the increment of ID. We need to do that. And the relationship between item and location. So start with the relationship. We have the tabs down here when we click on the item. So we want to add a relationship to location. And we want to have it from the location ID to the ID of the location. And that's it. Now they're related and combined together. And we save that. Now for the auto increment of the ID, we go into the data dictionary. And in the data dictionary, we have a lot of things that we can define on every column. So we can set things like auto find equals or auto find greater or equal, caps lock, commit, display only. So we can down here say that this field is a display only, and when we put it in interfaces, it will be a display only all over the application if we have this setting. No enter, no puts, required. We can set down here and say that this field is required. For instance, for name, we might want to have name required for a given item. And when we go back to the ID here, down here, you have the auto increment. So now we want to pick the system table and item ID. So here is where we set up where the ID is going to be stored. And save that. And do the same for location. ID, auto increment, and while we're in the database domain, we might also want to go in here because we have this category, and we might want to predefine what type of categories we want to be able to set on this. And you could do another table and relate to that table and store it there. But you can also go into the data dictionary and do a validation object. And this means that we can create an object with options to select from. And in this case, since we made this a text string, an ASCII, we want to store it as an ASCII value. So we could actually just leave it for free text, but we might want to add a validation object and say that these are the options that you can pick from. So we pick the category. If you pick this one, then you get an ID as well for the column, or they have two columns, but we just want to use one. And this is using the validation table in the database. So that's a different one. So let's go with this, and then we can say the attic. Don't ask me how that is spelled. Basement. Wardrobe 1. Wardrobe 2. Freezer. Yeah, you can put what you like here. And now let's save this. Oh, it looks like I spelled something wrong here. Yeah, I'll double click on it and I can go in here and just update this. Now we're inside the code of the data dictionary, which you can switch between by pressing F7. And here you can see your list, and you can see the rest of the data dictionary. And in our folder, we can see that we now created some items and location files that represent our table. And looking in our Git repository, we have the data dictionary added. We have the location data dictionary. We have a connection ini. We have an FD, which is a definition for the different tables we created. So here you can see what columns you have. If you want to save the representation, because you only have the column names here, you don't have a lot of information, you might want to go into the database builder, and in the file menu, click on output def and FD files, and we can select our newly created files and output def and FD. The FD we already have, but we can update them as well. And now when we go back into our source tree, we can see that we have these def files where you have a clear index and relationships and everything saved, so that you know how you have updated the tables. That's really nice to have in your source code manager as well. So let's just stage all of this and creating our first tables. So I commit this, but this is still only locally on my computer. As you can see, the origin main is still on this version. And if I refresh the Git repository and look in the data source library, it doesn't have any tables. So I go in here and I push this. Yes, push my main branch. And now when I reload this, I can see all the files have been pushed in here. So I can go in and look at the definitions of my tables. And I think that's all for the database. You can, of course, add as many tables as you like. Make sure that you only relate tables that are strictly related to each other, because in DataFlex, you can relate all tables that are kind of related with each other, but it's not always optimal to do that. Sometimes you might want to have a table that you just do a lookup in code, so to speak, but not use in the interface, because the relationships we create in the tables now will help us generate views automatically later on. So the relations you create here should support the views you want in the interface later on. So if you have any questions to databases or something you want me to dive deeper into in future episode, please comment below and I'll answer, and I'll try to make new videos about that. But for now, we will stop this video, and next week we will create our first views based on these tables. See you then.